right, so today we want to continue our presentation looking at forensic science. With this particular section, we are going to be looking at the specific jobs of crime scene investigators. We're going to be looking at evidence collection, kind of how different pieces of evidence are going to be handled, what types of things you might be want to look for at a crime scene, things along those lines. So, hopefully, you find this unit interesting as well as you look at the different learning objectives, right? Again, when we start looking at exams and quizzes and things like that, make sure you take a look at this information. But looking at the accuracy of witness statements and why or how witness information can be flawed, as unfortunate as that sometimes can be. Direct versus some circumstantial evidence, and then class versus individual evidence, which we'll be doing a lab on here shortly. I'll be looking at Locard's exchange principle. We talked about it just briefly in our first section of notes as well, but we'll be revisiting it in a little greater detail in this particular round. The seven S's of crime scene investigation, what takes place during each of those different activities, being able to sketch and label crime scene drawings, being able to identify what information should or should not be included in that, difference between rough sketch and final sketch, those types of things. And then describing and being able to demonstrate proper packaging and labeling techniques of various pieces of physical evidence. Now, understand that we'll be coming back to this multiple times throughout the course as we go through each of our different sections. So, for example, when we're doing our unit on serology, we'll revisit blood. When we do our unit looking at DNA profiling, we'll revisit DNA collection and things like that. So again, this is just kind of a cursory overview, if you will, of kind of what we're going to be doing. All right. So when we look at observations by individuals, what we know is that um, mentally we've got to try to take in as much as we can about our surroundings, and much of the time we do a lot of this subconsciously or unconsciously, I guess. I don't know, depending upon which way you want to phrase that. But there's lots of information that our brain and our body takes in about regarding our surroundings that we may not even be aware of. Um, Individuals that are in law enforcement or in other areas of expertise oftentimes are even better at it because been trained and know specifically things to look for and maybe make mental note of and things along those lines. But that ends up being very important to what we do as scientists, and that's not just in a forensic science standpoint, but in science in general. We want to be as detailed as possible and as observant as possible to make sure we're not missing anything. So again, we're always gathering information about what's going on around us. The rationale for that is it's a survival technique, right? So we need to be able to perceive, is there a loud sound in the distance that we're not even really paying attention to, but does that indicate to us, hey, there's maybe something that's dangerous in that particular direction that we need to avoid. All right. So we're always processing information, whether we're aware of it or not. All of that information gets filtered in, and then obviously we have to sort it to figure out what's important to us and then what we want to do with that information. Okay, so again, filtering out the stuff that's not necessary. We only want the things that are going to be important to us, excuse me, or pertinent to what it is that we're doing at that particular time. Now, understand that as an observer, we know that our observations are very easily influenced by our perceptions. Excuse me. And what I mean by that is, um, so take for example like magic tricks. Okay, we know magic tricks aren't in fact magic, but they are a deception, right? The individuals that are able to perform those activities are very good at being able to deceive our senses, whether it's sleight of hand techniques. Whether it's misdirection type of stuff, all of those pieces and parts help those individuals to perform their particular activities. And as observers, we find it very entertaining. But we also have to understand that that same type of process is going to influence our ability to understand what's taking place with regard to the world around us, right? So we know that there are things that can distract us or pull our attention away from maybe something specific that is taking place. Again, as a scientist, we need to be able to try to focus our attention as much as possible. Now, where we sometimes can run into really big problems is being able to fill in, maybe make up would be another way to describe this, or make sense of something that we observed, but we didn't observe all of, or maybe we didn't notice what took place, or whatever the case might be. There was something that caused us not to be able to take in all of the information around us. We missed something, but based on either something that we saw, maybe something that we've heard or seen before, or maybe a feeling that we have, we're filling in what we think transpired. And that's oftentimes where, as humans, we can get ourselves into trouble. Because again, as we start to fill in pieces and parts, it may not necessarily be accurate with what really took place. And from a scientific standpoint, and specifically in forensic science, as we look at witness information, that can be very, very, very problematic. And so we want to try to avoid that as much as possible. Okay. I'm going to skip this. We'll come back to this a little bit later. All right. Um, when we talk about witness observations, right, in terms of gathering information from witnesses, there's lots of different things that can influence the reliability of witness information. Our emotions are a big part of that. So when we are in an extremely stressful situation, we miss a lot of stuff. And I can give you an example. There was a class that I was taking, and we were put under some duress, and then I was asked to read a sign that was posted by this door, and I was supposed to be providing information to another individual about where I was, and the information that I kept giving to this other individual, I kept telling them a specific number, and the individual that was with me, that was observing what I was doing, kept saying, "Hey, are you sure that's the right number?" And I just kept repeating it over and over and over and again. And finally, the individual said, "Hey, listen, you need to stop. You need to take a big breath, and you need to look at that sign again." And when I did, what I realized is the number that I was giving them, so I was supposed to be giving them a room number. What I was actually giving them was the room occupancy. So let's say the room had an occupancy of 25 people. I kept telling them I was in room 25 when really I was in room like 132 or something crazy like that. So the stress of the situation influenced my ability even to read and perceive um, a sign on a wall, and it was easily read. It was in large enough font, um, but again, due to the emotion of the situation, it flawed what I thought I was reading or what I thought I was providing. And again, that's just one example. There's lots of different things that can do that. So again, our own anxiety, the amount of activity in the area. So if it's a very busy location, let's say you're at maybe an amusement park or something, and there is something that took place, and they want to know, can you describe? Maybe there was an individual that you observed, and they want to know, well, can you describe that individual? Well, because there are so many people in that area, you're going to have a lot of information coming into your brain that you're going to have to be able to process. And so sometimes um, our ability to discern that can become problematic. Okay. So again, it will be dictated by the environment that we're in. Okay. Obviously, eyewitness accounts vary from person to person, even under the same settings, same time amounts being shown, the same amount of information, or whatever the case might be, right? Because again, it goes back up to this up here, right? Our ability to observe stuff is going to be influenced by lots of different things. So if my mind is somewhere else, so let's say myself and someone else are looking at the same exact picture, and we've got 15 seconds to look at that picture, my ability to see that and their ability to see that could be very different based on what our brains are doing. So again, that becomes very, very important. Okay. When you talk about what takes place at a crime scene or at an accident scene or whatever the case might be, as people are interviewed, oftentimes it's the pieces and parts that come in little bits and pieces that investigators are able to take and start putting those pieces together and kind of getting a big picture type of idea of what actually took place. But initially, you're just taking all of these little snippets of information from lots of different sources, and then you're trying to make those all make sense based on what was observed in that particular location. Okay. So again, when you think about detectives and the work that they do and being able to witness or interview witnesses and things like that, understand that they're not getting all of it initially. They're just getting bits and pieces until they can put it all together. This is kind of unfortunate, but 87% of wrongful convictions are due to flawed eyewitness accounts. And what that simply means is, let's say I saw a crime committed, I saw the individual that committed the crime, and I go to police and I tell police this is what that individual looked like. Well, again, based on my anxiety, based on how emotional the situation was, how busy the situation was, all of those different things. 87% of the time, well, not that statement's not completely correct, but a lot of that information is going to be flawed, and therefore I may wrongfully identify the individual that committed the crime because of so much stuff taking place. And obviously, from a law enforcement standpoint, from a judicial standpoint, that's not necessarily a very good thing. All right, it becomes quite problematic. So we want to try to limit, obviously, errors that we see from a witness standpoint. Let's see. The next thing I've got is, oh, come on, we'll do that later. All right. So improving observation skills. This is something that really this is beneficial to all of us. Even going through our day-to-day lives, trying to be able to recall certain pieces of information or certain things that took place. And I'll be the first to admit I'm not very good at this. I am easily distracted to say the least, but improving observation skills is something that can be very beneficial. Whether you're talking about taking notes or even like watching a movie or a television show, being able to kind of put together pieces of things that are taking place. But we know that our ability to pay attention already isn't as great, so we really need to make conscientious efforts to make good observations about our surroundings. Um, so knowing like if you go to a restaurant where the different exits are, or if you go to a movie theater or a performance of some type in some type of facility, right? Knowing where the exits are in the event of an emergency, or like at school, knowing where our AED is, right? At Northmore, our AED is just outside the gymnasium. Um, but being able to identify where those things are, because in the event of an emergency or in the event of something taking place, just knowing or being able to put together those details and remember pieces and parts gives you a better chance to be successful and having a good outcome of that particular event. So again, being able to filter out information we assume, again, the assumption part is problematic because again, when we assume stuff, we don't necessarily know what we need and what we don't need. Assume things as being unimportant. We don't know what's unimportant. All right. So we have to turn off those filters, turn off those things that are maybe the term that you might hear to that is blinders. We get rid of our blinders and really start taking in more of our surroundings, just being more, I think the term probably would be situationally aware, knowing what's taking place around us. So that would be if you're out jogging alongside the road, maybe only having in one earbud or AirPod or whatever in one ear as opposed to both ears, and maybe not having your music up as loud as possible. Or if you're walking on down the street and you're looking down in your phone and scrolling through stuff or whatever, not necessarily doing those activities because at that point you have no idea about what's going on around you, and maybe there is some type of crime that's being committed, or maybe there's some type of event that's taking place, and you are completely unaware of that. And I know some people will say ignorance is bliss, but at the same time, ignorance. ignorance, I'm sorry, can be exceptionally dangerous. So we want to try to try not to put ourselves in a situation that could be dangerous for us. So again, something to just kind of be mindful of there. Looking for patterns and make connections. That's again putting together the pieces and parts of things that we want to make sense. We don't necessarily want to do that, right? We want to be able to allow the information to come to us and be able to process that information and then use it in a way that's correct and beneficial. So again, the assumption portion of that creates problems. We know that our memories are faulty, and so therefore we want to try to write down anything and everything that we observe and see, and then obviously be able to photograph it to make it as accurate as possible. So this would be in a really specific arena, the really specific application of forensic science, but being able to document everything so that it would be admissible, obviously, in from the standpoint of a court of law. Um, but even if we see some type of event that's taking place, you want to write down or make note of all of the different details that you can recall, because you don't know which of those details would be the really the most important details, and how those details could pertain to something else, maybe bigger or larger than what you can anticipate. Okay. All right. So let's see here. Next. Again, just a couple different things. Spotting differences, taking 20 seconds to spot 10 differences between the two pictures. Kind of an interesting one to do. Same thing with this particular one. All right. So, crime scene investigation and evidence collection. Because at the end of the day, that's one of the big jobs of forensic scientists is being able to know what information is important, collecting it, how to collect it, and then obviously being able to process it as well. As well. And at the end of the day, we know that again, judicial cases are going to be based upon the reliability of the evidence or information that is gathered. And so, in order to have the greatest chances of success in a court of law, we need to be very thorough and very dutiful about what we collect. Okay. So, a number of cases historically that have been affected by poor evidence collection and then chain of custody stuff. If you were to Google any of this, you're going to get lots of them. Probably one of the most famous ones, at least in the last probably 20 years. I think it's been 20 years. I don't know. Maybe it's been more than that now, but is the O.J. Simpson case. O.J. Simpson, the famous football player, famous actor, um, stood accused of murdering his wife, and I think it was her boyfriend at the time, but was shown to be not guilty. Right? It was given the not guilty charge in a court of law, and a lot of that had to do with the poor evidence collection and evidence contamination that was caused by the individuals that actually conducted the investigation. It's kind of an interesting one to look at, and if you have a few minutes, it might be worth taking a look at it just to see kind of what was done. And when you read through some of the stuff, you're like, "Oh my goodness, I can't imagine as professionals that this is what took place, especially in such a high profile type of event." But it's kind of interesting when you go back and look at it. Got to know what's important in a case, and really at the beginning of a case, you don't know. You don't know what's going to be important. So you need to take every precaution to preserve as much evidence and as much value in the evidence as is possible. Okay, and understand that all of the evidence itself is just one piece of the puzzle. So taking all of those pieces of evidence and putting them together, much like you would a puzzle, to be able to get a picture of actually what took place, so that the investigators and the detectives can make sense of the totality of whatever that event was. All right, and obviously that becomes more complex if you have a multi-scene crime scene or something like that. That challenge becomes much greater under those particular settings. All right, so we talked about Locard just a little bit, Doctor Edward Locard. In our first section of notes, and hit some of the stuff that he had done. But what Locard is most well known for is his principal exchange, Locard's exchange principle in particular. And basically what that is, or the explanation of the principle of exchange, is anytime you have two individuals that come in contact with one another, or even an individual in contact with another um, item, another object, there's going to be some type of physical transfer that's going to take place from individual to individual, or individual to object, or object to individual. And so, as a result of that, from a forensics science standpoint, that proves to be really, really beneficial. You can start making linkages as to where an individual was or had been, based on the information that you're able to gather from that exchange. Okay. So the materials that end up being exchanged are to make up the trace evidence. As we go through I think we'll be doing this in a couple sections, but I'll be looking at different pieces of trace evidence, and how they're analyzed and how they're gathered and all that good stuff, and more specific types of trace evidence. But again, pet hair, hair on a brush, paint chips, fingerprints on a can, all examples of trace evidence that could be left behind as a result of this principle of exchange. All right. So again, Dr. Edmund Lacard first detailed this particular interaction. Okay, and that's what this is. So Lacard's exchange principle: any action of an individual, and obviously the violent action constituting a crime, cannot occur without leaving a trace. Right. And hopefully that makes, hopefully that makes sense on some level. Even if it's you sitting down on someone's couch, there's an exchange of material. You're going to have some of the fibers from your clothing be left on the couch, some of the fibers from the couch left on your clothing. If it's walking across the floor in a pair of socks, maybe even a hardwood floor, right? You're still going to have an exchange of materials from that floor to your socks and vice versa. And so, let alone if you take something else and take it more nefarious. So maybe looking at something like an assault, where you have an individual that ends up being violently assaulted. You're going to have the exchange of lots of material potentially under those particular settings. Now, the exchange is important, but being able to find evidence of that exchange is even more important. And that's really what we get into as we make our way through the remainder of the units. Lacard's principle, though, again, person to person or object to person, there's going to be some type of exchange of material. Okay, what that does, it doesn't necessarily equate to guilt. It just simply implies that the two objects came in contact with one another, or that the object had some residue from contact with something that had been present. All right. So let's say, for example, I don't know, you had an individual that was, let's say you had an individual that was working with an explosive compound, and then maybe they had some explosive compound residue on their hands, and they had put some explosive material into a duffel bag or whatever, and then they emptied that material out, and then they put, I don't know, they put any number of other materials into that duffel bag, and they gave you that duffel bag. Okay. And what they gave to you in that duffel bag wasn't anything that was criminal. It was just what they gave it to you in. What that would simply mean is that if they were to test that bag's going to have evidence of that explosive residue. Even though you yourself weren't in contact with the explosives, you would have some of that residue that would be present near you as well. All right, so that becomes important. So the greater the intensity, the duration, nature of the materials, the greater the transfer of materials. So again, fist fight versus shaking hands, we would anticipate finding a greater amount of material on individuals that had been involved in a fist fight versus if just you and I had shaken hands. And again, I think that should make sense. All right, I want you to take a second to read this particular statement, and then I want to talk about a couple things here. So I'm not trying to insult your intelligence here, but I want to read this and kind of talk about this a little bit. So wherever he steps, whatever he touches, whatever he leaves, even unconsciously, will serve as a silent witness against him. Not only his fingerprints or his footprints, but his hair, the fibers from his clothing, the glass he breaks, the tool marks he leaves, the paint he scratches, the blood or semen he deposits or collects. All of these and more bear mute witness against him. This is evidence that does not forget. It is not confused by the excitement of the moment. It is not absent because human witnesses are. It is factual evidence. Physical evidence cannot be wrong. It cannot perjure itself, and it cannot be wholly absent. Only its interpretation can err. Only human failure to find it, study, and understand it can diminish its value. All right. So when you think about this, all right, when you think about obviously the idea behind forensics, and again making sure that we don't cloud things with our own judgments and things like that. So if you think about each of these different parts, right, all of these and more bear muteness, goodness, bear mute witness against him. The idea that none of these things speak, vocally speak. There's nothing that these are going to say, "Hey, here I am. You need to collect me because I'm important." But as long as we as the scientists are able to understand the importance, or at least understand the importance of collecting these things to determine whether or not they serve value, that in and of itself is very, very important. Okay. Um, Not only that, obviously, evidence itself doesn't get influenced by the moment. Okay, so it's not confused by the excitement of the moment. That is going to be very, very true. So we go back to some of the things that influence our perceptions as humans, and we talked about anxiety. We talked about the busyness of a particular environment and things like that. The evidence is not influenced by that, right? That's important. So as scientists, whether we're talking forensics or anything else, as scientists, we have to understand that being able to um, take information from what has taken place serves us very, very well and becomes very, very important in terms of what we're trying to do. Okay. The last really couple things here, its interpretation can be in error, right? Our ability to not find it or not understand what it's telling us is problematic. And obviously, if we don't find it, study it and understand it can diminish its value. So again, evidence that excuse me, evidence that has been collected and stored for years and years and years, which we know there are a number of cases where that has occurred. It's not an error, right? It has not changed over time. It has not. So if you have DNA evidence collected 60 years ago, it hasn't turned to somebody else's DNA. It still belongs to the individual that left that particular piece of information. Our ability to understand what that information is becomes very, very important. Okay. All right. So as we look at evidence, this is getting a little bit more specific now, but looking at the two types of evidence, two general categories, you have direct and circumstantial. So direct evidence is something that you or someone else has observed firsthand. All right. So, if there is a car that has been stolen, this would equate to me watching the individual get into the car that is stolen, watching the individual that they are accusing of committing that crime. I saw the individual get into the car and drive it away. That is direct evidence. Um, I have firsthand knowledge of what exactly took place. In the event someone is stabbed, I see the individual that stabs the victim. Right. That is direct firsthand evidence. Okay. That differs from circumstantial evidence in that it is with circumstantial evidence, it's indirect. I didn't see it happen. However, based on what it is that we have, it does show that something has occurred, but doesn't necessarily prove exactly what took place. Okay. So on here, finding blood at a murder scene links a suspect to the murder scene. It doesn't prove that the suspect did it, right? So if we have a murder scene and we have an individual that we have taken into custody that has blood on their clothing, um, that then links the individual to the scene, but does that mean that that individual committed the crime? Well, not necessarily, right? So let's say you're, I don't know, walking down the street and you see someone that is covered in blood and you decide to render aid, right? Are you the individual that committed the crime and committed that assault? No, right? You were trying to render aid, but because you're covered in blood, that could be considered circumstantial evidence, right? And so then that would fall on the uh, investigators and detective to determine that actually no, you're not involved with that. You were actually trying to help. And there have been a number of cases where people have claimed, let's say there was someone that was stabbed, and they say, well, I just happened upon the scene and I got covered in all this blood as I was performing CPR or trying to help that individual. And so then they have to go back and look at blood spatter evidence and different information to try to figure out whether or not that is accurate, or whether they're making that information up. And again, that can become pretty tricky at times. So some of the different types of circumstantial evidence, physical evidence, physical circumstantial evidence could be impressions that have been left. We'll talk about impressions as we make our way through some of our subsequent units, especially when we look at tool mark stuff. Fingerprints, all examples of that. Your um, physical evidence should cut down on the number of potential suspects, ideally and hopefully. Again, depending upon what it is that you've collected. And then your biological evidence, blood, semen, hair, skin, right? All things that again should be able to cut down on the number of suspects and eventually get down to the single individual. Ideally, sometimes that is still very very difficult because maybe you don't have a match, right? If we're talking something like DNA, we have DNA evidence, but we don't know who it belongs to. Again, can create issues there. Now, when we talk about different types of evidence, you've got class versus individual evidence. Class evidence is going to take a large pool of individuals and narrow it down slightly. So, if we, let's say, for example, we find blood evidence at a crime scene that is not the victim's blood, so we would surmise that it potentially could be a potential suspect's blood. Well, just saying, "Hey, we have a suspect's blood," doesn't do us a lot of good. Every human on the planet has blood. What we would then need to do is be able to close that down a little bit and say, okay, maybe we found AB negative blood at the crime scene that is not that does not correspond to the victim. Okay, so AB negative. So if you're anything other than AB negative, you would be excluded then as a potential suspect. So you can go from a very big pool to a much smaller pool very, very quickly. Now, the problem with class evidence is that it doesn't identify a specific individual or a specific situation. Can help narrow them, but again, you from a judicial standpoint want to identify things very, very specifically. That's where individual evidence becomes very, very useful. So this is going to be able to identify a very specific person or thing. So again, fingerprints are unique to individuals. DNA is unique to individuals. Things along those lines become very, very useful when you look at individual evidence. All right, so the crime scene investigation team, what all or who all is involved with that? And really, the first responders are going to be your law enforcement officers, almost without exception. They're going to be the first ones on the scene. Sometimes it potentially could be an EMS, like an emergency squad or something like that. That could be a first on the scene, but oftentimes it is going to be your law enforcement individuals. And so they're going to begin everything by securing the scene, making sure everything is clear for the individuals that are going to follow them into the area. They'll cordon off the area. They'll start to separate potential witnesses and begin the investigative process at that particular point. You've got the crime scene investigators, kind of the stuff that you and I are focusing on in this particular course, being able to document the scene, take photos of what's kind of there or taking place, make sketches, collecting the evidence, identifying what you think is or is not evidence, all becomes very, very important. Your medical examiners, which could be a coroner, it could be a deputy coroner, it could be just an individual that's identified as being allowed to pronounce individuals that are deceased in the event that you have a body. You're going to have somebody there that has that has that authority. And then eventually, depending on what's taken place, detectives to be able to interview different individuals and look at the information that is going to be processed by your crime scene investigators. That will be a much later process, though. You need to understand that obviously to be able to analyze that information from the evidence takes time, and then it gets passed on to the detectives. Again, depending upon what the particular crime is and what the scene looks like. You might have some type of specialist that gets called in, though this tends to be somewhat unique situations. If you need to gather bugs, so you need have maybe have a specific entomologist that would come in and examine the or collect the specimens at that site. Blood spatter experts, forensic environmentalists. There, I mean, there's lots of different realms that this can go, and each of those individuals would have a role that they could potentially play. All right, so we talked about the seven C's, the seven S's, sorry, of crime scene investigation. These are the seven that we want to go through. So the very first thing that has to happen, and this is where it goes back to, like you see in the picture, law enforcement officers most of the time, and that's going to be securing the scene. They need to make sure that everything is locked down, so to speak. It's under control. They're going to make sure that anybody that follows them to that site is safe as can be. So maybe there's been a motor vehicle accident. They're going to make sure that maybe there's no lines down. If there are lines down, those lines have no power to them. The vehicle is extinguished if there was a fire. There's no threat of explosion. You could make up any number of scenarios. That's going to be their role in all of this. So they're going to restrict access. They don't want to let anybody and everybody into the area, because obviously you need to be able to process that information to be able to make sense, obviously, of what's taken place. They're going to begin a log of all individuals that make their way into the crime scene. Um, they will have a written log where it documents who the individual was, what they were doing there, what time they went in, and oftentimes what time they left that particular crime scene. Because again, you need to document all of that information to identify if you're looking at maybe footwear patterns or any type of contamination. You need to be able to identify where it may have come from, or if you have a maybe piece of evidence that doesn't match up or doesn't make sense with what you think you should find there, or what really is being shown should be there. Sometimes this can help identify that as well. And depending upon what's taken place, they can make the request to have the specific individuals that are going to be necessary to process that scene also arrive. So they're going to be the ones that would, in the case of Ohio, would call in like a BCI, the Bureau of Criminal Investigations. They would come into that particular site and check things out if they think that there's been a crime that has been committed in that particular location. The second thing that's going to take place, the second of the S's, is to separate the witnesses. And again, you want to make sure that what you're going to do is create an opportunity for those individuals, oftentimes, to write down their particular observations. So if you've heard witness statements, oftentimes they're going to take a written witness statement. And what this is, if you're ever given this opportunity, you write down anything and everything that you can think of that you observed, smelled, heard, um, whatever, any perceptions that you had. This is where you document that, and then they'll look that over. They'll read through that. They'll pass that on to the individuals that need it, in particular, oftentimes detectives, and they'll start again taking all the pieces and parts and putting those in together to give a better idea of what the entire situation really was at the time. Okay. Separating witnesses also prevents witnesses from kind of muddying up one another's um, memory. The idea that if you and I were both there, I saw an individual in a red shirt, you saw an individual in a green shirt. I don't want you to talk me into a green shirt, and I don't want to talk you into a red shirt, right? We each need to be able to know, hey, this is what I saw, and this is why. And so we don't want to come up with a story that is basically one that matches. Okay, they may match, and if they do, from a detective standpoint, you'd be like, yes, that's perfect. That's what I want. But if they don't, then again, they need to be able to process that and make sense of what it is that they saw. Okay. So again, all of this is going to be stuff that in witness statements you're going to want to identify. Um, as much as is possible. Do you know the individual that was harmed or that was involved in this particular activity? So on and so forth becomes very, very important. Okay. All right. So the third S in our seven is going to be that of scanning the scene. So we're talking about this obviously from a forensic scientist standpoint. We want to be able to look at the totality of the scene, kind of take it all in. Okay, so what all do we need to get photos of? Right? What do we think potentially could be important in the grand scheme of everything that we are looking at? So let's say, for example, the picture that we see here on the slide. Do I need to have a picture of the living room as well? Well, if it doesn't look like any of this particular activity was taken place in the living room, then really probably not. You may want it just to get an overview of the entire area, um, but you want to really know, okay, we see that in this particular picture, you can see where the blood has even goes to the door. You can see a couple looks to be maybe footprints right here and here by the door. That would definitely be something that you would want to know. Okay. We see a mop bucket. I don't know if this is a mop right here, but we see that we see something that's been moved through the blood. So again, these are all important things because what this tells us is blood was present and then something was drugged through it. Okay. Blood was present and someone stepped in it. So that's all important stuff that you would need and really want to be able to document. Now, in this picture, we can also see they've marked something here. You can see it's got the numbered marking right here. I don't know what that is. This is just a picture that I swiped off the internet, but the idea is still going to be very, very important to be able to look at the totality of the scene and determine what you need to get pictures of. So is there some type of secondary crime scene? So do these footprints then go out the door and then lead to somewhere else, right? Because you would need to have photos of that as well. So again, being able to make sense of everything that's taken place becomes very, very important. As that takes place, again, people are going to be assigned to different jobs. So you would maybe have someone that's going to begin to collect blood samples. You're going to have someone that's going to be taking pictures of all of this material. Maybe you want someone that gets up close pictures. Maybe there's some separation of the blood. You get the plasma that's beginning to separate from the rest of the blood cells, which can indicate a period of time that has elapsed. You're going to have somebody maybe that's going to process whatever this is here laying on the ground. Maybe someone that's going to document these footwear patterns. Maybe you're going to photograph that, get some measurements, so on and so forth. All very important jobs that would need to be done. Okay. Excuse me. The fourth S is going to be that of seeing the scene, and what that simply means is, okay, we've got an idea of what we need. Now let's get it. So now we want to get very specific photographs of what we need to show that helps to explain what took place in that particular environment. Okay. So in this particular one, we can see this individual setting up to take a picture of a pool of blood that's on the floor outside of a restroom stall. Again, who knows where this is, but you'll notice that there is spatter even on the wall. So in addition to getting picture of the blood pool itself, you're going to get spatter here on the divider, spatter on the door, spatter on the wall, all stuff that would need to be photographed because it helps to explain what took place in that particular location. The fact that there's spatter indicates blood that was moving. All right, it wasn't someone just laying on the floor bleeding from a they I don't know, maybe they slipped and fell in the bathroom stall, hit their head, and it was a pool of blood. Well, if you fall and hit your head, you're not going to have blood spatter, right? That's not how that works. So what caused the spatter that is being shown? Well, his job is not to figure that out. His job is to document all of that. All right. So that's part of being able to see the scene, knowing what you want to get. Now, seeing the scene is also going to involve getting pictures of everything that you're going to include in your sketch. And we'll talk more about crime scene sketches here in a little bit, and you'll have the opportunity to make your own crime scene sketch based on information that you're provided with as well. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Okay. You always want to include some type of scale ruler as well to give an idea of size that then can be used to extrapolate out larger items or larger areas based on what it is that you're looking at. All right, so that takes us, I think, to 5 here, looking at sketching the crime scene. All right, the sketch of the crime scene ends up being very important. Now, today, a lot of it will be done digitally using computer programs and things like that, and there's nothing wrong with that. We're going to practice, obviously, doing it longhand because we don't have the the tools at our disposal, but it's still a good thing to be able to practice. So with this, the rough sketch is going to be done in pencil, most likely. It could be done in pen. It doesn't really matter, but you're going to be getting measurements of everything. So you want to measure from set positions, whether you're going to measure from a corner of a wall, or in this case, you're measuring maybe from a windowsill, whatever the case might be, you're going to get specific measurements that you can then use to put things where they belonged based on what your photograph shows, right? That becomes very important. So getting a photograph of the entire scene. So maybe you would set your camera up in this corner of the room, or maybe over in this corner of the room, or maybe you get pictures in all four corners to be able to show where everything was laid out or how it was laid out. And then you start getting measurements distance wise from where those things might have been. You're going to include a compass direction, all right, and then a reference scale as well. So everything will be drawn to scale. So whether it's 1 inch equals 1 foot, or a quarter inch equals 1 foot, or however you decide to do it. And like I said, you're going to get some practice with this, and we'll talk about this in greater detail. The rough sketch will be redrawn to include finished final measurements and final drawings and all that good stuff. But it needs to be very neat, very tidy, and it will include a number of pieces of information. Right, you're going to include the location, when it was, where it was, who it was done by. All of those types of things are going to be information that you're going to include in your drawing as well. Okay, so you can see case number, date, name of investigator creating the sketch. All right. So number 6 here, looking at searching for evidence. All right. So again, as we sketch it, and really this would fall under the category of kind of scanning the scene as well, being able to identify pieces of evidence, but different ways that this can be done. If the scene is relatively large, or even if it's very complex, you're going to need to be able to search for evidence in different ways. And all of this is going to be dictated by how many individuals you have being able to look, how big the area is, the type of the crime scene. All of those different things are going to influence your ability to identify evidence, preserve evidence, and collect it. Because at the end of the day, let's say, so we can see this particular one. This is an outdoor crime scene. Let's say you have something on the ground that, if it were to get wet, would be ruined. It would disappear. So you want to process that evidence very quickly. You want to find it, identify it, photograph it, and process it as quickly as you can, so that it isn't compromised by the elements. All right. So that becomes very important. Now, how you search for evidence also varies. There are what, 4 or 5 really main search tools that you're going to use. You can use the grid search pattern, which is where you would go one way and then turn 90 degrees and go opposite to that. So basically, you would form the grid pattern. If you can envision that in terms of the search, the search technique. Quadrant wise is really good when you look at houses, quadrant or zone, like in houses or warehouses, where you have specific areas. So, like if we're doing, I don't know, if you were doing in a house, you could have someone search the bedroom. You could have someone else look in the kitchen. You could have someone else look in the living room. Someone else look in the bathroom. So on and so forth. To get the idea. Each of those are different zones. I skipped one here. Linear is where you just basically walk in a straight line. So, for example, if we go back to our previous slide where we had the blood on the floor, you had footprints at the door. Maybe there's mark on the door, footprints at the base of the door, the blood, the blood trail, or the blood on the floor. Maybe that leads to something else. Maybe that leads to something else. Again, that would be a linear type of search. And then a spiral one, often used in underwater settings, or really, really big, complex areas. But you basically just create that spiral effect, and oftentimes you work from your outside and you just work your way in towards the middle of that particular area. That's the spiral type of search. Each one has its benefits. Your grid is going to be good if you have lots of people that can work. Like imagine arm length to arm length and cover a large area. Linears if it's relatively confined and relatively simple. Quadrant or zone, like I said, houses or warehouses. Spiral, open water, things like that. Large fields sometimes, though grid works really well in large fields as well. It just depends. Okay, but regardless of which way is used, right? When it comes to looking for evidence, whoever is performing this task has to be very thorough and very systematic in terms of what they're doing. It's not just a random, hey, we're going to go walk here and see what we find. That's not good. That can lead to the destruction of evidence, that can lead to missing of evidence, and both of those can compromise the integrity of a particular event and a case. So we want to make sure that we're thorough in terms of how we get that. Again, we're looking for evidence using different lighting and tools and things like that, all going to become very important. All right. So that's number six. The last one here is being able to secure and collect the evidence, and that's really what we're going to look at the remainder of this particular section, and then obviously moving forward as well. But being able to secure and collect evidence becomes very important. Evidence got to be correctly packaged, sealed, and labeled because at the end of the day, it is evidence, and in order for it to be something that will hold up in a court of law, it has to have been collected and processed appropriately. And there's a lot of hoops, so to speak, to be able to jump through to be able to do this. And we'll talk more about that kind of as we go through. Different types of evidence require different packaging techniques. I don't think that should be all that surprising. You don't want wet, bloody clothing to sit in a plastic bag. That's not good, right? We know that over time it's going to mold. It's going to lead to the degradation of that biological evidence, and that is a huge problem. We know that historically it has happened, but again, we try to limit that as much as possible. When you're looking at powders, a common practice is going to be that of a paper bindle. Paper bindles were used historically, like when you would go to a pharmacy. This is how some of the medication would be provided to you. Um, Again, this is going to be small quantities of material that you would collect and preserve in this particular fashion. That's not something that's going to be left that way indefinitely. Okay. All right. Skip that for now. All right. So looking at packaging evidence in specific ways, and like I said, we'll come back to this as we go through. But arson evidence, um, if you collect liquids from an arson scene or a suspected arson scene, you want to put those in airtight glass vials or in metal paint cans. Both of those are going to be very good. The liquids, obviously, in the airtight glass vials, so that you don't have any loss of any of the volatile organic compounds, any of the material that is going to be caused as that material goes from a liquid to a gas. Very, very important. No rubber lined, no plastic, because those materials oftentimes, as they interact with uh, flammable solvents, flammable liquids, degrade both rubber and plastic over time. Okay. And so as a result of that, there you go. Will alter your gas chromatography mass spectrophotometry results. So you'll get some inaccurate information. So we try to limit that as much as possible. So if we know that these things can influence the reliability and the accuracy of our later tests, we'll just eliminate those. Put them into a glass vial with a good lid, tighten that thing down, and obviously get it back to the lab as quickly as possible. Large solid pieces, going to go in metal paint cans. So maybe you've got a piece of couch that has some type of accelerant that has been put on it, or you just want to test it to see if it did. You're going to cut out a section of that couch. You're going to put it into a metal paint can, and then you can take that to the lab to be tested. Again, create opportunities to sample the gases from that. So you're always going to collect reference evidence as much as possible. So if we have maybe an area of the couch that we think may have had some type of material on it, we're going to try to find a spot on the couch that maybe did not. We'll take it as well, whether it's just the outer part or whether it's part of the cushioning as well. We'll try to get as much of those different pieces of evidence to serve as comparators as is possible. Again, just increases the reliability and the accuracy of what it is that we're doing. Being able to find some of that evidence can be tricky, especially if you're talking about liquids that could be used as an accelerant in an arson investigation, gasoline and things like that, kerosene, even diesel fuel. All right, that material runs. It doesn't stay right where you put it. So being able to find it behind the baseboards, or maybe it's run between floorboards, or maybe it's soaked down into lower layers of the carpet. or it got into the drywall, or whatever the case might be. There's lots of different places you can find this information. Knowing where to look is kind of the key. Looking for areas that aren't burned and other flammable materials that have not been combusted, again, to serve as comparators, to serve as a means of looking at and examining next to what it is that you do believe was altered. In a lot of violent crime scenes, blood is going to be a major component, a major piece of evidence that's going to be collected. So you want to make sure that you can collect it correctly. Obviously, you need to allow those objects to air dry if possible, right? So you may have a bloody shirt at a crime scene. You're going to collect it at the crime scene. You'll package it, you'll wrap it in paper and then put it in a box and then take it to the lab. Once at the lab, they're going to allow it to dry. So they'll hang it up, allow it to air dry. It's going to be put into a special room so that there's no contaminants that are going to be present. It's going to be out of direct sunlight, so you don't have to worry about degradation of that evidence. And then it can be analyzed once it's dried. Um, Sometimes the analyzing will start while it's wet, but very seldom. Most of the time, it is going to be in fact dry. Okay, so it's going to be wrapped individual, clean paper, placed in a brown bag, sealed, labeled. The seal and the label will have case number, the individual that sealed it, the time. All of those different things become very, very important. The label will also include what's inside that paper bag, not plastic bag, paper bag, right? So that again, you know what type of evidence is found inside there. Depending upon the object, you may not be able to easily transport it, so you may have to scrape that blood or absorb that blood onto a piece of gauze, and then put it into an evidence envelope and then take it back to the lab. But the important thing to remember, even if you think it all is from the same individual, so maybe you have a victim laying that's been stabbed in a bed or something. I was just watching a video on that last night. Um, you would need to collect blood samples from the individual. You would need to collect maybe the article of clothing that they had on. You would take some samples from it. It would go into its own container. Samples from the bed, they would go into their own container. If you found blood maybe on a sink, that would be collected. It would go into its own container. You get the idea, right? Because again, what that's going to do is allow you to ensure that each of those pieces of evidence um, either are the same or aren't the same, because now all of a sudden that creates some new questions. Okay. Once you have it, you're going to freeze that evidence or keep it refrigerated over an extended period of time. So, again, having evidence today from 60 years ago is not uncommon. They still have it stored in lots of different crime labs. That's where a lot of these cold case hits are kind of coming from. Being able to open these old pieces of evidence and re-examine them with today's technology, which ends up being very, very useful. Saliva and semen, other biological pieces of evidence. Um, if you have an individual that has been bitten, you want to swab or gauze the areas where the bite marks occurred, or where the bites are said to have occurred. And what you're doing with that is you are going to eventually examine that for the presence of other cells and extra DNA that is not theirs, right? So again, in our saliva, we know we have DNA, so we would want to look at that to compare. Semen stains would need to be dried. So on articles of clothing, you would want those dried and either scrape those or cut those out of the item, and then they're going to be in clean paper, placed in paper bags, and transported to the lab where they can be analyzed. Garments, you're going to collect them as a whole garment. Okay, so if it's let's say it's a dress, or it's a pair of pants, or it's a shirt, or a pair of underwear, whatever it might be, you're gonna label whom they belonged to, who collected them, when they collected them, the time, the date. All of that information is going to be part of what would need to be identified with those pieces of clothing, and that would be the same type of thing that you would do with an item of clothing that is also blood covered. You would need that as well. and you want to, again, handle those items as little as possible. I think that kind of hopefully goes without saying. You want to reduce the likelihood of having any type of contamination. And obviously, in the collection of these, you're going to be wearing gloves, right? You're not doing any of this with just obviously the bare hand, because then you're going to introduce contaminants. And we want to try to minimize that obviously as much as possible. Now, any presumptive tests, and we haven't talked about this yet. Presumptive tests are used to determine whether or not what you're looking at is what you think it is. So maybe you have a red stain on, I don't know, tennis shoe, and you want to know, is it blood? So you're going to perform a presumptive test to determine yes or no, it is or isn't blood. Whatever your presumptive test is, you don't want it to destroy your evidence, right? That's going to be very important so that you can still go back and use, if you find that it is blood, well, now we want to know, well, who does it belong to? Or more importantly, what blood type it is, or whatever the case might be, right? So you need to still be able to use that evidence even after you have collected it and presumptively identified it. So then you would have a confirmatory test that says, okay, yes, it is blood, and then we want to kind of go from there. All right, so that becomes very, very important. Being able to label the different types of evidence, again, labeled and maintained to provide that to serve as evidence in the event that there is a trial. Because if it's not collected appropriately, if it's not labeled correctly, if you can't account for its location at all times, it is going to be an inadmissible piece of evidence. And at that point in time, that can become very, very damaging to court cases. So you want to make sure that you have everything that you can as accurate as possible. So information that's going to go on there is going to include a case number. That should go without saying. The case number becomes very, very important. The item inventory, every item that is collected, every piece of evidence is going to have an evidentiary number that will be assigned to it. So this is evidence, piece of evidence, or evidence number one. This is evidence number two, so on and so forth. That will be included in that. What the item is that's in there. So we have a blue and white striped T-shirt that was recovered at blah 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 blah, whatever it might be, or it was recovered from a washing machine in the residence at whatever. Right? That's going to be a description of what that is. If there's a suspect, you're going to identify that, the name of the victim. If you can identify that, eventually you'd be able to. When and where it was recovered. Um, all very, very important to making sure that that evidence can be accounted for at all times. Who received or who recovered that evidence, and then once it was recovered and signed into the lab, who received it, right? That becomes important as well. Now, again, all of this has to be verified via photos, right? So you want a photo. Hey, I have a picture of this blue and white striped T-shirt laying in a washing machine. I've got a picture that shows that, right? So I can match up what I've collected with what my photos of the scene are going to show, and that kind of goes back to what we had talked about previously as well. Now, as you pass that evidence along, you're going to have a chain of custody. You're going to store it correctly, whatever it may be. Paper bags or large paper boxes are going to be the two most common means of storage. Again, you avoid plastic because it seals it up too tight, leads to degradation, things like that. So we try to keep it in a container that allows further drying, but that's not going to compromise the evidence in any way. So it'll be taped shut over the opening of the either the paper box or over the paper bag. So imagine taking like a lunch sack, folding it over, and putting a piece of tape over that opening that you've sealed. And what that does is it prevents anybody else from being able to get into there without opening that bag or cutting open that bag in some fashion. Okay, which becomes very, very important. So if someone does sign out that piece of evidence, which happens all the time in crime labs, they're going to sign that out. They're going to open it somewhere else other than where you have your original label on there. So they would open it up maybe at another seam or whatever. They're going to take out what they have in there. When they put it back, they will put a piece of tape over the opening that they created, signing their name, the date, why they had it out. Da, 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 da. You get the idea. All of those pieces of information will be recorded on that piece of evidence. Okay, so date and time, received from, received by, purpose of the request. So why are you why do you need to look at that? Again, in a crime scene or in a crime lab, maybe somebody's going to do a biological test for blood. Maybe somebody else is going to examine it for trace. So maybe they're looking for some leftover hairs or whatever, right? All of that would be part of what they're attempting to do. Then you get to the part where you're going to analyze it. This is going to be the specific technicians in a laboratory setting. They're going to look at the evidence and they're going to run very specific tests based on their knowledge and what they know to be able to get as much information from that piece of evidence as possible. So this is where the lab technicians have to be knowledgeable about how to conduct the tests that they're looking to do, and then how to be able to use that information in a beneficial way to help further the investigation, or further, let me rephrase that, further the ability to um, connect the dots, so to speak, to be able to provide more information than what was known previously. Right. So at the end of the day, technicians aren't determining innocence or guilt. They're simply looking at the evidence. So we go back to the CSI effect. If you've ever watched CSI on television, oftentimes they're looking at it, and they're also then going out and saying, "Hey, you're the person that did this, and here's why I know." That's not how that works. The lab technicians do not get to do that. They just look at that information and determine how it might help the investigation. And then the last part here, looking at the crime scene reconstruction. Once everything has been analyzed, all of the information is gathered, all of the witness statements, all of the pictures, all of the lab documentation, everything is put together and is going to be sent to the detective or group of detectives that are going to work through that information and try to reconstruct what took place in the commission of that particular event, right? Or what caused that event to take place. So they're going to be putting it all together and try to make sense of it. So again, there's forensic engineers. So if we talk about like a building collapse, they're going to look at the sequence of events that led up to the collapse of that particular building, right? It's being able to make sense of the totality of the situation. So remember, evidence itself can't lie, doesn't lie, but what we get from it or how we look at that evidence can be misleading. So again, this is where our bias as investigators has to be put to the side. We have to go in with an open mind. We have to look at just what the evidence is showing us, not what we think that it means, but what that it shows to us in terms of its value. Now, when you look at difficult situations, staged crime scenes are going to be hard for forensic scientists because they're going to be designed to look a very specific way. We want it to make it look like an accident, or maybe someone was shot and killed. We want it to they want it to look like a suicide, right? And so individuals that are really good at a particular craft and have done their homework and done their research, that can be much more challenging on your forensic scientists. Um, and while it's more challenging, not to say that they can't figure it out, it just creates a bit more of a challenge for them. Okay. All right. So hopefully this section makes sense. Like I said, make our way through our upcoming units, we'll be talking about collecting and gathering evidence and types of trace evidence in greater detail. All of that information is going to be coming out as we make our way through our next several sections. But if you have any questions or anything, please make sure you reach out to me. Otherwise, I will see you hopefully soon.